I can tell you one of the most stressful kinds of moments I would have being in the nonpartisan office as Assistant Chief Clerk and Parliamentarian is being called into a committee hearing, blind, no information, usually a frantic call from a committee secretary or chief consultant. Hey, things are blowing up in this committee, come down and resolve it. And just walking in and you get 15 different stories of what happened and you don't have time to roll tape and review. You're a nonpartisan individual trying to call the balls and the strikes as you see them. And then when you go into the other role, there was just a lot more volume of things I have to deal with. So now I'm in charge of providing multiple documents to the full membership as well as Democratic members.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined by Brian Ebbert, Speaker's Floor Director. Floor Director. Hello, Brian. Thanks for coming in and telling us a little about yourself.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
So, well, I've been a Capitol employee now for 31 years, so I don't know where you want me to begin.
Let's go back. 31 years. What is that? 1991. 91. Okay.
Yeah.
Just the end of Willie Brown coming in. Okay.
Willie Brown had a few years left still. So, actually I started on April 1st, 1991. So we call ourselves the April Fool's Caucus, the few of us that started that day. I came directly out of UC Davis through a paid internship program through the chief clerk's office. What was interesting to me was I applied for that internship in November of 1990, and the big thing that happened in November 1990 was Proposition 140, which of course instituted the nation's most strict term limits on California, and also cut the legislature's budget almost 40% overnight. Wow. So I go into my interview with then Chief Clerk Brian Kidney, and a few other gentlemen that had been working there since the 1960s. Here I am, some 20-year-old kid from Davis, sitting in this room, these old guys, and it was the weirdest interview ever. They were just talking amongst each other, and I'm just sitting there nervous, probably sweating through my cheap suit. And then I remember them asking me, so why'd you take Mandarin Chinese for your foreign language? Yeah. And I was like, I'm interested in maybe becoming a diplomat one day or what have you. Studied, Far East Asian studies and what have you. And then they just kept talking amongst themselves. And then the chief clerk said, you know what? I took Russian for my foreign language, so it's okay. These communist countries. I'm like, okay, this is just a weird interview tactic. And I left there thinking, okay, they didn't ask me anything about like politics, legislature, poli-sci, none of that. And but then I got a letter saying, yeah, you've been selected. But what was odd there was because they, as longtime assembly staffers at the time, they were all about to get pushed out essentially because of that 40% budget cut at the time. From November 1990 through the first half of 1991, legislature laid off hundreds of employees and also gave severance packages to many of them and golden parachutes and what have you. And so by the time I actually started on April 1st, 1991, they were all gone. Right. There was no chief clerk. There was no assistant chief clerk. There was the clerk's office had been pretty much wiped out. And member offices, committee staffs, got rid of entire departments in the assembly. So you had this big drain of institutional knowledge that had just been kind of, taken out of the legislature. And where did a lot of those staff go? Into the lobbying corps, consultants, into the executive branch. So you pretty much had a transfer of power from the legislature to these other entities. And then I'm pretty much there as inexpensive labor coming fresh out of college. And, I grew up very poor. My childhood was, impoverished to say the least, the first 7 years of my life. And so the thought of working in this beautiful building and wearing a suit and being around all these important people was just like something that wasn't in my realm of possibilities. So I was just very honored, and I am honored to this day every time I walk into that building, just being in awe of the institution. So me starting there in 1991 was interesting because it was under the speakership of Willie Brown, and all those titans of California politics were still there. The Ross Johnsons, the John Burton, Jerry Philando, Dick Floyd, Willard Murray. I mean, it's just all these folks.
Learned a lot of new words. Huh?
Yeah. So being there in the days of, floor sessions that it's, there were some computers back then, but if you wanted to find out what's going on during a floor session back then, you show up in the bill room 7:30 a.m. when they open, get a copy of the file, and try to figure out what's going to happen. You kind of buckle up and just watch the members go at it. And a lot of them knew parliamentary procedure, and there were it was a much more closely divided House, so there was a lot more conflict on the assembly floor, I'd say, verbal.
It was like pretty split, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, but what hooked me, in addition to the grandeur of the whole thing being surrounded by these icons, was I was placed as this paid intern in the engrossing and enrolling department of the assembly desk. And these are folks that are kind of, at the time were, off in the basement of the Capitol, and they work in teams. And they still do to this day, where they read out loud to each other bills to proofread them every time they're amended. And then there's a process to take bills to the governor once they've been passed by both houses. So I was given that role of basically bill delivery, get signatures, and doing some of that kind of paperwork. And so 1991 budget cycle, state budget at that time was $48 billion. We had a $14 billion deficit in a $48 billion budget. And back then, it's 2/3 vote budget.
Right.
So that was the day of the big five. So you would had Willie Brown and the Republican leader on the Assembly side, David Roberti and the Senate Republican leader on the Senate side, working with then Governor Pete Wilson. Those big five would come up with the deal, and $14 billion deficit. That year, they decided to do $7 billion in tax increases, which was at the time the biggest tax increase in U.S. history at the state level, and $7 billion in cuts to programs. So virtually everybody hated it,
right?
But it's what they had to do. And at the time, and you may recall this, if you didn't have a budget passed and enacted, signed into law by July 1st, legislative staff weren't getting paid, vendors, contractors, no one was getting paid. Yeah, there was IOUs applying for no interest loans for your own paycheck, and also what Willie Brown did at the time. As a pressure tactic, he would have floor sessions every day, 7 days a week, even if we had nothing to do, as a pressure tactic, because his philosophy was it is our constitutional duty, their primary duty, to get that budget passed so the state can operate. And so you cancel your summer vacations, cancel any time off, cancel your weekends, cancel your 4th of July, and you're going to be here in session. But what happened that year, that deal was cut in June of 1991. And under California law, you have 12 days when that budget bill hits the governor's desk, 12 days to sign it, veto it, or let it go into law without your signature. Typically, you would pass the budget and all the trailer bills at once. In this instance, I don't know if it was the excitement of we got the budget deal and they got the 54 votes on and 2/3 vote over in the Senate. And we brought the assembly bill down to the governor's office. However, then all of the trailer bills stalled, or a few of them did, and the governor couldn't sign the budget bill without the trailer bills still being in limbo, because that would just blow up the whole budget bill.
Right.
He couldn't veto it. The budget had never been vetoed in California history until later, when more recent Jerry Brown gubernatorial veto, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. But so that was not seen as an option. Plus, to get that 2/3 vote, to have to redo it again was not in the cards. And so Willie Brown, master parliamentarian, he figured out a way, to get the governor an extra 12 days. So on July 3rd, close to midnight, actually going back here, Willie Brown got his start in the 1960s in the assembly. One of his first committee chairmanships was the Engrossing and Enrolling Committee, which no longer exists. Now it's just a department of the Chief Clerk's office. So he knew the ins and outs of engrossing and enrolling and how bills moved around the Capitol. And so he knew you could withdraw a bill from the governor's desk, and with the governor's permission and a motion of the House, and then re-enroll it. Usually that's done to amend the bill. Like, there's a bill on the governor's desk, we need to get it back, fix something, and then we'll send it back to him with another vote. So what he did at 10 minutes to midnight on July 3rd. At midnight, by the way, that bill would either become law or you'd have to veto it, or you would either sign it, it goes into law without a signature, or you have to veto it. So Willie Brown was presiding. He loved to preside. It was a late night session, obviously, almost midnight, and he just was working the file and said, members without objection will return Assembly Bill 222 from the governor's desk. Order return to enrollment without objection. Okay, next bill, item 45, moved on. No one objected.
Right.
What they didn't know was I was then deployed, go down to the governor's office, get that bill back. Went down there, and Speaker's Chief of Staff, Michael Galizio, followed me to make sure I didn't depart with that bill, and suddenly California had a budget that was in place without the governor's signature, because we needed to get that back to the Assembly chamber. And that was exciting for me as a 20-year-old kid, and that
like $48 billion in your hands, right?
Yeah. And reporters had caught on to something's going down here. Is that the governor's budget bill? Or, and they're chasing me down the halls. And, I came into the chamber with that budget and handed it to Speaker Brown, and he held it up and said, members, I have the state budget here, and I'm ordering it returned to enrollment. By this time, it was a little after midnight. Gave the governor an extra 12 days so they would have that window to negotiate the trailer bills. So me, as a young intern, being part of this, even though I was just like this ministerial part of this action, that was exciting. It's like, wow, and what's this parliamentary procedure and stuff? I want to learn more about this, and that, I would say, launched my interest into the whole system and those nuances of the legislative process.
Yeah, and back then, kind of with the tighter parties and the the 2/3 votes, sessions would go really late at night.
Right.
Really long time. The budget, I remember, in the early 2000s, the budget wouldn't be passed till August?
Yeah, they kept getting later and later. Yeah. We thought it was bad going to mid-July or late July. Then it went into August. Eventually, the latest one was early October, I think, under Governor Schwarzenegger. And that's when the Constitution was changed.
Right.
I think everyone was kind of tired of
all the
dragging
antics
it out.
And the fun. What do you, in the early 90s, it's like a different world compared to today, right? Like, could you smoke on the floor back then?
Yes, and I remember some interesting stories there. Because it was the early 90s is when there was that big push to ban
indoor smoking.
Public or smoking in public buildings. And I remember when that bill was being debated on the floor, Gerald Philando is a Republican from Southern California, and he had gotten into a verbal altercation with Dick Floyd, because Dick Floyd loved to smoke, sometimes cigars on the assembly floor.
Right on the floor.
Right. Yeah. So Dick Floyd and Curtis Tucker Jr. would sit in the back of the chamber at their desks and smoke cigars during session. And so Mr. Philando asked Dick Floyd to please stop smoking. Dick Floyd said, none of your business.
Right. Not that kind, probably.
And he said, hey, well, and there were some words exchanged, and I just saw some blowing of some smoke into Mr. Philando's face, which, that was probably around 1991 or 92 as well. So I thought that, seeing those things that aren't on mic that are interesting are always fascinating, especially as a young staffer.
Yeah, that's just wild to me that everyone, you go into Capitol offices or the lobbyists in the hallway, just all be full of smoke.
Oh yeah,
and it wasn't that long ago.
So in addition to the 20-hour long sessions, and it's hot and stuffy. Right. You've got people that haven't showered in probably a couple of days out in the halls, and then you've got this cigarette smoke on top of it. It was not pleasant, to say the least.
So, in the early 90s, you're in this engrossing and enrolling department. Kind of, where did you start taking your next steps to kind of get where you are today?
Yeah, so I did 7 months of that, and then someone retired at the assembly desk and applied for her job. And so I became the assistant daily file clerk, and I worked on the daily file for a number of years. And that, of course, daily file is a
monster.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's a lot of information in that document.
So back then, how was the daily file made every day?
It was the first publication to be automated. So we had desktop publishing software right there on the assembly floor. So I came in that we had our own personal servers and everything. So it was like just the internet hadn't quite been launched. No one had PCs really at their workstations, but we had these I remember these huge monitors that someone once dumped water into by accident. This desktop publishing software. And so we'd create the agenda for each day, and that would be all the committee agendas, all of the floor items, and cover to cover. It'd be hundreds of pages a day, and it's definitely a good way to learn the process, though.
Yeah.
Of all the publications, I mean, there's the journal, history, and file. I've always been a big fan of the daily file, just because it's people used to carry them around everywhere. You don't see as much of that anymore because everything's on your cell phone or tablet. But all the information that you need to know, who's on which committee, which bill has been in print for 30 days, which bills are in second or third reading or concurrence, all that's there. So, and then from there, I became the Assistant Chief Clerk and Parliamentarian, which I was very grateful to Dotson Wilson, longtime Chief Clerk. He's been my mentor for many years, and because there had never been an Assistant Chief Clerk / Parliamentarian, it was always just Assistant Chief Clerk. But he saw the wisdom of having someone with a focus on the parliamentary procedure, because he was the Chief Parliamentarian. So, okay, you're going to be my parliamentary go-to as a backup. And so when he gave me that title and position, I took it very seriously, and I thought, if I'm going to have that in my title, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get a credential as a registered parliamentarian. And I'm like, how do you do that? I didn't know, right?
What is that? Explain us, what is a parliamentarian, and kind of how do you become one? Yeah.
Well, it's, someone that's an expert on the rules of meetings, right? So in the United States, there's two big organizations, the National Association of Parliamentarians, that's the larger one, and then there's one, the American Institute of Parliamentarians. I joined both organizations, and I took a credentialing test. I just crammed for it, 1,200 parliamentary scenarios that covered everything from legislative bodies to political conventions to boards and commissions and nonprofits and corporate charters. And I just crammed, and I got my registered parliamentarian credential. And I think having worked in the legislature for a number of years, and having a focus on the legislative process really helped. And I got my master's degree and focused. My thesis was partisan conflict on the assembly floor and how term limits played into that. So I just wanted to make sure, if I'm going to be relied on for parliamentary and procedural information, that I would be, the person in the room that would have the answers or know how to get it very quickly.
Right. Because especially, like, what year did you start doing this? The parliamentarian?
2008.
2008. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then I have to renew every 6 years. So take another test and get practical experience. So
earlier you were talking about how, under Willie Brown and the big staff cuts, Dotson, came into his role, around that time, or was it a little before?
Yeah. So during my internship and the first several weeks of my full-time job in the assembly, we had no chief clerk. We had an acting chief clerk. He had been promoted up. He was the assistant chief clerk essentially, and as a result, the assembly actually hired a parliamentarian for about 10 months or a year. Jack Knox, who was a former Speaker pro tem of the assembly and lobbyist. He was hired to be the assembly's parliamentarian while we had no chief clerk, and he sat there in front of the presiding officer. Now, Willie Brown and Jack O'Connell were the presiding officers of the assembly at the time. They didn't need much, parliamentary help, but to have Jack Knox, who was an icon here in California as well, as a presiding officer, to have him sitting down there in the front during the tumultuous term limit, era of that, especially that first year, I think was kind of help calm, members' fears because, like I said, the desk staff had been eliminated, pretty much a lot of those staff. And so they had like a brand new reading clerk. His name was Norm. And he came in off the street and no training. And I think Willie Brown even admitted to it at one point in a press story that it was like he wanted to show what you do to the legislative branch when you just wipe out all the institutional knowledge. Here, reading clerk, go. And so he's losing votes and just putting the wrong things up on the board. And he laughs about it now, but it was very stressful for him at the time.
Yeah. Oh, Norm's still around?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. At some point he became a lobbyist, and he's out there somewhere. So,
all right, Norm, if you're listening to us, you have to come on, tell us about it.
He can still do the roll call from those days in the early 90s. Yeah, from memory.
So like that, you're talking about how like, now you have the speaker and then you have like a speaker pro tem who runs the floor session. Mm-hmm. You're saying back in the 90s, Willie would run the floor session himself most of the time.
Every speaker has their own style. Some speakers like to preside. Some would rather have the speaker pro tem or assistant speaker pro tem preside. So, Willie Brown, he enjoyed presiding. And like I said, there were a lot longer floor sessions then. I'd say a lot more conflict on the floor. I mean, if you look at hostile motions and
just hostility, right? There's been fights.
And remember, part of my master's thesis was to actually measure those that conflict on the floor, and I did it through several ways of hostile motions and even budget bill votes and what have you. And you see a huge spike in the mid 90s. So, and I, drew the correlation to the passage of term limits, but it was also, the House was more evenly divided. And when you have a more evenly divided House, you have more of that conflict.
Right.
So, with the majority vote budget now, the 72-hour print rule, with the supermajority, I think there's less inclination to have those kinds of blow-ups on the floor. Yeah, you'll have, impassioned speeches, occasional procedural activities, but it's nothing like it was in the 1990s.
Right.
And that's why it's hard to teach it to folks.
Yeah, even like the 6-year term limits, right? Because like even there you had like 2 members from the same party possibly going after the same Senate seat and just eyeing each other for 6 years, right?
Right. Yeah, it's, unless you're there and see the floor activities take place in front of you, it's just like, I know Dotson used to use this as an example. It's one thing to read a book about baseball. You can't read a book about baseball and then go become an expert player, right? You have to actually play the game. And same with the rule book. You can read the rule book if you want, but I think it's going to be a waste of time. You actually have to get in there. And I do a lot of staff trainings and new member trainings and orientations over the years. And I always just say, focus on this list of rules. These are the ones that we use all the time that you're going to see.
Right.
And even watch video clips. Here's some examples that you might want to take a look at to see how things used to be done in case they, arise again. So have to be prepared.
How late does the archive go? Do you guys have video of?
Assembly started being televised in the, I think it was 1990. So it was right before I started.
So you have all the video of all that.
Yeah, they're all available. Yeah.
In the back. Okay. That's great. So then, you're assistant, chief clerk, and then kind of where do you go from there?
Yeah, so I did that for 10 years.
So 2008 to 2018?
Yeah, 2008 through till the first part of 2017. Yeah, so so maybe that's more like 9 years. But during that time, I did a lot of, I would say, what I like to encourage staff to do in the legislature is always identify what you think like your weaknesses are and work on those, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, I was so focused on the floor all the time. I was like, okay, I need to focus on committees because that's really where all the work gets done. And so over the years, I really started focusing on committee hearings. I reviewed all the committee rules, helped rewrite virtually all of them because they were all kind of needing updating because sometimes they're just kind of passed down from year to year. So working on those kinds of projects. And so felt like I had, expanded my knowledge of the entire process. And then when our floor director had moved on in late 2016, I was asked, hey, you have any ideas who would be good at that job? And I thought about it for a couple of days. I was like, I don't know. It's kind of a niche job to be floor director, for the speaker. You have to know parliamentary procedure, kind of have to know about, bills and, some of the politics and policies, personalities and all that. And I was like, oh, you know what? Why not me? Yeah, sure. I'll apply for it. And Speaker Rendon hired me, and it's been great. It's like going from a nonpartisan office after 25 years into what even though it's, obviously the speaker is a partisan figure, he's also the speaker of the whole house.
Right.
And I think that's how our unit kind of views our role, is like we serve the house. Of course we serve the speaker and the majority party and give that, strategic advice we called upon to do so. But we also serve the entire membership because the assembly floor, belongs to everybody.
So like what specifically is different from what you do now in your role today than it was kind of when you were just kind of a neutral?
Well, I can tell you one of the most stressful kinds of moments I would have being in the nonpartisan office as Assistant Chief Clerk and Parliamentarian is being called into a committee hearing, blind, no information, usually a frantic call from a committee secretary or chief consultant. Hey, things are blowing up in this committee, come down and resolve it.
Right.
And just walking in and you get 15 different stories of what happened, and you don't have time to roll tape and review. You just have to,
I always like when they call Dotson in, you're like, oh.
Yeah, and you walk in and everyone's looking at you like you're gonna.
It's like an NFL game getting the replay booth.
Yeah, and so you have that component, but you're a nonpartisan, individual trying to call the balls and the strikes as you see them, and then when you go into the other role, there was just a lot more volume of things I have to deal with. So now, I'm in charge of providing multiple documents to the full membership as well as the Democratic members, which is for instance for Democratic members, the Democratic Floor Alert, the pre-session document, which goes actually to all offices in the assembly, the chamber calendar, like all of anything chamber related. So guest visits, tours, ceremonies, state of the state address, the organizational session, all those things are coordinated in my office. I used to work in the floor unit many years ago. I don't know if you had to work on a ceremony, but whether it's printing the programs or dealing with all the guest requests, media security, whatever all those logistics, plus the parliamentary components to it is quite a big production. We're talking about hundreds of people coming together for an event, and you don't want to mess it up because it's very special to the members involved, of course.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, what was that at the end of last session? Deborah Gravert was retiring, and they were planning a ceremony for her. But there was also business to do at the same time. So everyone's kind of waiting there for the ceremony. But there's business to be done. All the members aren't there yet. So it's can be like herding cats at some point, right?
Yeah, it is. And under COVID is very challenging, of course. And that's another thing that was interesting to deal with, because in March of 2020, as everyone knows, everything just came to a halt suddenly.
Right.
And I never worked from home. Mm-hmm. It was I was one of a small group of people in our house that went in every day, especially in those early days where it's let's figure this out. We had to figure out from scratch, how do you operate an entire branch of government that can't shut down, that can't work from home. You need public input, you need debates, you need floor votes, you need analyses of bills and all of these things. And you've got to, California is different than other states. We have different constitutional requirements in terms of public access to the legislature. And so we had to invent, from scratch, and being in those rooms, I'm kind of honored that I was in that room, but it's all almost kind of like a blur now because we had to figure out all the legal issues. Even the concept of, can you ask someone what they're, if they have a runny nose? Or can you take someone's temperature? It's that was unheard of. I was who's going to take the temperature? People are saying, we have the National Guard come in and do that, or a nurse, sergeants, a doctor, sergeants. Someone trained. So basic questions like that, to have to come up with that. Have this core group of folks, almost like a task force, to come up with the technology even. Do we use Zoom? Do we use Microsoft Teams? We went with WebEx in the assembly because it was military grade video conferencing that the Pentagon uses. We wanted something secure. We didn't want the Zoom bomb, things going on, hacking, and you use plexiglass in the rooms. My colleague and I Actually, when we were coming up with the 6-foot distancing throughout the assembly, our chief sergeant said, I'll go to Home Depot and get a few PVC pipes that are 6 feet long. We use those as measuring sticks, so we can just deploy us throughout the rooms. And we were there just measuring all those 6 feet of distance, ordering the microphone covers, working closely with our rules committee on, all the health and safety protocols, and our legislative counsel on the legal questions. And it was just a lot to put together. And we were essentially given a time frame. Basically, we need to have budget hearings within a few weeks.
Right.
And to go from no playbook to just inventing it literally overnight was not easy, but we did it. While everyone else was kind of holed up at home, we spent 3 weeks. And the legislature, as went into recess for a few weeks so we could figure it out. Both houses were going through the same issues. And, the whole phone system, all of that. And then on the assembly side, we... I give kudos to our Chief Information Officer, Sohrab Mansourian. He, because he helped push this, was remote testimony stations. No other state did that. And that's where we deployed cameras outside the Capitol first, and then we deployed them to other cities so that a member of the public wouldn't have to come into a public building during a health crisis and give their testimony on bills. And we had high quality video feeds in LA, Fresno, San Francisco. And I think, that was something, that good that the assembly did during that time. And we were looking at what other states were doing. One state, they met at a drive-in movie theater.
Right.
Members drove in with their cars to vote on bills, so they wouldn't have to be around other people in a building. We try to get it as innovative as possible and to be as accessible as possible, but to not ban the public from coming into the building. We definitely try to keep crowds to a minimum by deploying those technologies of phones and video conferencing, RTS, all that. So
yeah, it's interesting because a lot of we're California, we're this place of high tech, all the companies and things like that. Yeah, a lot of our systems are not that high tech, and like a lot of committees still use like fax machines because they can't scan you or email you something. So I imagine that had to be quite a transition, like kind of updating the systems and things like that over there.
Well, I can tell you the past 6 years, there's been a huge transformation in technology for the assembly floor in particular. So those member tablets, they have an app called the Member Portfolio app. When members are on the floor or wherever they are at in the state, they can pull up what's on the agenda, which bills do we plan to take up. So if there's 100 bills on file, but we only plan on taking up 25, they can select those and those 25 will show up there. They can, over the past 5 or 6 years, that's when we deployed the letter portal. So whether you're a lobbyist or a member of the public or organization, you upload your letters in support or opposition of legislation. So all those are available to the members, which they love. Instead of just seeing the list of like, okay, these organizations oppose, they can actually click, okay, ACLU, why do you oppose? Oh, okay. And actually read the letter and understand the point of view versus just seeing an organization listed. And to have that technology available to members, I think, is just a game changer. And they get notes from their staff on there, vote recommendations, and they can see all the committee votes, all at their fingertips. Just a few years ago, I mean, it was just all those floor binders and paper everywhere. A lot of members don't use binders anyway. Their binder is their tablet. It has everything they need. Right.
So like a big thing during that time period, maybe still now, is remote voting. Kind of, where'd you guys end up on remote voting, and kind of, you see that being something in the future?
Yeah, there was, obviously legal experts were consulted, and I think the two houses came to different conclusions, and the assembly just did not go with remote voting. I mean, we did pass a provision for proxy voting near the end of session in 2020, but yeah, we did not deploy remote voting.
It's funny because like in the Senate, it's a verbal vote, right?
Right. Yeah.
So in theory, you could just be on like the phone and like verbally vote, but yeah, the assembly actually had to like push the button. So
yeah. Well, and they had that unfortunate, I think their last week of session that year when the entire Republican caucus were exposed. So that was very unfortunate for their house.
No, they've had a lot of excitement over there with the menstrual cup and then the COVID caucus. And
yeah, that was a very interesting year. I think we've seen some very interesting things over the past couple of years.
Yeah. Kind of like on the assembly side, 31 years you've been there. Kind of, what are some of the most memorable things that you remember happening on the assembly floor that you're just kind of like, wow, that was like a crazy day at work today?
I talked earlier about how I, that first couple months on the job, just being part of that budget situation. Also part of that first month, like former President Reagan spoke on the floor, like 15 feet away from me. I was like, wow, like these famous people that are here. We got the Dalai Lama. Right. We've had, Vice President Al Gore. To see and meet a lot of these like people you only see on TV or have read about. But like some of the interesting stories, of course, many I cannot share. But I remember like wacky things like, where a staffer once thought it would be a good idea to bring a baby goat onto the assembly floor. And I say it didn't end well for the carpet. You talk about smoking on the assembly floor. I remember staff when I first started there, these are staff that had been here since like almost the 1950s. So, they had a trick. They would keep a burning cigarette in their ashtray if they're going to take a long lunch to make it look like they just stepped away.
Really?
It's like, really? Yeah. So it was a bygone era, but we saw some interesting things, altercations with members, when those kind of heated debates go on. Of course, the most epic, controversial kind of thing I've ever, witnessed on the assembly floor was the evenly split vote for a speaker in December of 1994. You had 40 Republicans voting for Jim Brulte as speaker and 39 Democrats and one independent voting for Willie Brown as speaker. So 40-40 split. And then we didn't have a speaker for a month and a half, and for the first time in California history and only time. And just the chaos around that, and the emotions and the speeches and the, lacking. We couldn't get a quorum for a month. It was crazy times. So,
and so what ended up happening? One of the Republicans eventually went over to Willie's side. Is that what happened?
Yeah. So in that instance, 41 registered Republicans won the November 1994 elections. Mm-hmm. However, one of those Republicans, Dick Mountjoy, was in this interesting situation where he was running in a special election that was consolidated with the general election for a Senate seat. So he appeared on the ballot because he had no opponent. He appeared on the ballot for the Assembly and the Senate, and he got elected to both. He was the only candidate running in each one. His intention was just to go to the Senate. The Assembly race was not in his picture. But when the Republicans picked up 8 seats in 1 year, of course his focus became, okay, I'm going to get sworn in to the Assembly, vote for Speaker Jim Brulte at the time, and then resign and go over to the Senate and take the oath there. Well, the longtime Democratic majority under Willie Brown said, no, you didn't intend to run for that seat, and you cannot be elected to 2 incompatible offices. They had legal opinions, law professors, and all sorts of arguments on both sides about, what's your legal right to be seated in the Assembly. And, I wrote a whole section of it in California legislature, the book. You should read it sometime. But it goes into the nuance of all this. But bottom line is, between Election Day and swearing-in day, Paul Horcher, who was a Republican from Diamond Bar at the time, he had been treated well under Democratic Speaker Willie Brown. He was given the vice chair of Ways and Means Committee and over the objections of his own caucus. And so when it came time for that, vote, he switched parties to independent, from Republican to independent. And then he voted. When he cast his vote for Willie Brown, he slammed his fist on the table and shouted Brown when they called his name for the vote. And that created the deadlock of 40-40, which, it was like, deflating the air of the balloon for, Republican Party, which was ready to take over with their 41 votes. So then that started the cycle. First of all, he had to, the House decided to, a month and a half later, disqualify Mr. Mountjoy from his assembly seat, creating a vacancy, which then created a 40-39 vote for Speaker Willie Brown, which extended his speakership till June of 1995. So he got 6 months of his speakership to kind of settle things, come up with kind of a bipartisan power sharing agreement. Then we had 4 speakers in 12 months. So it went Willie Brown, Doris Allen, Brian Sentensich, and then Kurt Pringle.
Right.
Basically, there was a series of recall elections that took place that eventually led to where Republicans had a solid majority finally in January of 1996, elected Kurt Pringle as Speaker, and he served 11 months as Speaker, and then Democrats retook the House.
Wow.
So,
11 months.
But the parliamentary, fireworks that day went on for many hours. And like I said, that was a time when the titans of parliamentary procedure were all still around. John Burton versus Ross Johnson and, Jan Goldsmith and, all those folks, Brulte, Pringle, all those folks, Tom Hannigan.
Right.
Yeah.
It kind of, as you said, now it's kind of different. You have 2/3 majority. It seems like members are kind of the same page, but what kind of parliamentary tricks are you seeing now? And are members coming to you asking you for advice and kind of things can do? Like the last member I really remember using the rules regularly was Calderon, Chuck Calderon. He would always be up there, mentioning this rule or that rule. You don't see as much of that anymore, other than the kind of Republican objecting at the end of session to a certain amendment or things like that. Yeah,
it's often now where it's it seems more personality driven. Like if someone has it in their personality to kind of create a ruckus,
right,
then they're going to create a ruckus. And there's been, I'd say, less of that. Whether that's good or bad for the institution is for someone else to decide. But just as an observer, there's a lot more order now than there was, like I mentioned, in the 90s or even 10 years ago. But I mean, most members do not have the time to sit and study parliamentary procedure. Same with staff. So they hire folks like me to hopefully, help do that for them. But because it does take effort and studying, as they're focusing on public policy, they're focusing on the politics of situations, their constituents. And so to get up to the speed of where you can create issues is hard. Plus, if the result is always going to be the same, then why keep doing it? And you may recall a few years ago, we had a couple of Republican members that would raise points of order quite often, and then they weren't reelected. And I think things have kind of simmered down since then.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm ready when things
Ever
are.
Since 2018, there just haven't been much ruckus on the floor.
It is exciting to watch, I have to admit, but I think the public and members get a distaste for it after a while. It's like,
it gets a little annoying.
It can be exciting to watch sometimes, in retrospect, but ultimately they're there to debate respectfully, have their disagreements, and then vote up or down, and sometimes you win, sometimes you lose.
Yeah, kind of. You were like telling a story earlier, but actually you had to like physically deliver a bill. Mm-hmm. To the governor's office, but take it back to the assembly. Is that still how it works, or is it all digital now?
Yeah, that's still when a bill passes both houses, it's printed on the white paper, the enrolled version, and then they take that bill to the Secretary of the Senate and the Chief Clerk. They sign it. I used to have signed those bills as when sometimes it's hundreds of bills. I would say, here, sign 50 of these, and I would be stamped as acting Chief Clerk. So he'd bill those out, and then we'd go down to the governor's office, and the governor's secretary would sign for them, and that's the one that he uses to enact the bill or veto it. And I remember that time in 1990 when getting that bill back. I remember Pete Wilson out on in the governor's the horseshoe area patio there. Like I said, it was midnight, so staff are out there just drinking a glass of wine, and I'm just there, as I said, this 20-year-old kid, and they give me the bill back. Karen Morgan, who was the governor's legislative secretary, gave me the bill back, and it's still paper, and that paper gets filed with the state archives. So, and the bill files, that engrossing and enrolling unit I was telling you about, they keep those original bill jackets and every version of the bill. It's all stapled in there, all marked up and everything as it moves through each house. So there is actually, just like Schoolhouse Rock, that bill
just moving along,
moves along. Of course, everyone's looking at it electronically as they're working on it, but the physical bill is actually being guarded and moved along. They're locked away in file cabinets and what have you. And then when they bill becomes law or vetoed or just dies on file or in committee, all those at the end of each 2-year session are boxed up in archive boxes and shipped over to the state archives. So there's a permanent record of it over there. So they've got boxes and boxes like Raiders of the Lost Ark, final scene of legislation going back to 1850 over there.
That's interesting. There's like this story from like when Pete Wilson was governor about how he wanted to send a bill back without his signature, but the guy who was in charge of bringing the bill back got distracted or something like that and forgot to do it or left it on a copier or something like that. And so then the bill became law.
Yeah, there was, I think, six or nine. Yeah, there was a handful of bills. Yeah, they got sidetracked and became law without the governor's signature because, they have to be, physically presented back to the chamber where they originated and signed for.
When's the last time you remember something like that happening?
Well, that was the only time that's happened that I know of.
Then,
so it was like the 1990s.
Okay. So it hasn't happened again since.
No. But, here we are in the Senator Hotel here. This place has a lot of history. Samish Alley was, I think, on the 3rd or 4th floor. The entire floor was Artie Samish's suites. Buffet, among other things. And he got his start in engrossing and enrolling in the assembly in the 1910s. Then became, of course, the most powerful and corrupt lobbyist in California history. But when you read his memoirs, he talks about how he learned where bills went and how you could maybe get something changed in a bill. He had some interesting people on his payroll. He eventually went to federal prison, but and that's when I worked in E&E, they had the gates there in the basement to prevent the public from going back there. And I remember being told on day one, like, never let a lobbyist back here, never let a staffer back here. No one. It's only the E&E staff, because that's what goes to the governor, and you strike a word, that's what the law will be.
Right.
So
one word can mean a lot.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's interesting. You always hear about this, like at the end of session, like the Senate will be waiting for bills to come back, or the Assembly will be waiting for bills to come back. So are you literally just like waiting for like the Senate to give you just like a stack of bills?
Yeah.
And you actually physically have to, none of this is digital. This is all like actually physically waiting for bills.
So, I mean, I'm sitting at my desk there in the Assembly chamber sometimes, especially when you're up against a constitutional deadline where you have to get bills before midnight. And if we've seen a bill that's passed the Senate floor, it's like, where is it? It's 30 minutes ago. How long does it take to walk over? And they're doing the same. That's right. And sometimes, we're holding just to wait, so that we can ensure there's an equal flow of legislation. If someone feels like their bill is being held up, we don't want to get into those games. So, we're looking at the door, or we see a Senate sergeant walk in. We're like, is that the bill? Is that the bill we're looking for? And it's the physical.
So the sergeants bring them back and forth, or
on the Senate side, the Senate sergeants usually will bring them over to our side. In our house, I think our clerks will deliver them over there to the Senate. Artie Samish, in his memoirs, admitted that I think it was the 1935 session, he killed a bill on oil extraction tax by delaying its delivery to the Senate, because he had a friend just wait till after midnight. Again, we don't have that anymore in California, thank goodness. But it's like one of those, when people are wondering, like, why are things so stringent? Why are things, kept under, lock and key? Why is everything signed for? It's because of the bad old days.
Right. That's funny. Kind of, that was then. This is now kind of something similar, right? We have a special session here on oil. Kind of, what's your role in the special session? And kind of, can you give us a little background? A lot of people don't know what a special session is. What are the rules for it? Things like that.
Right. Yeah. Well, so we organized the first extraordinary session of the 2023-24 session a few days ago. And a special session is exactly what it sounds like. You can call it special or extraordinary. Both those terms are used in the rules and in our Constitution. But the governor has the sole authority to call a special session of the legislature, and he or she gets to determine what the topics are. And so we organize, each house organizes on the day that he calls for. And we generally, and this is, I've gone through 36 of these special sessions, we just organize the house, which is just, substituting the officers from the regular session, just pretty much substituting all the rules and everything, right. Except in a special session, several rules don't apply. 30-day rule, the file notices, that you'll have different committees often in the special session, the legislative deadlines like committee hearings and things like that are often different. Now, each house can choose to create special rules for a special session, but generally, historically, a lot of the rules don't apply. Now, you can't get around certain things. 72-hour rule applies to special session bills. The 3 readings on 3 separate days applies to special session bills as well. So, but there's leeway. Under the Constitution, each house has the authority to govern its internal affairs and adopt its own rules. So, on our first day of session, all we did was organize the house. And we haven't adopted rules per se for extraordinary session. When rules aren't adopted, by the way, you just go to the most recently adopted rules and use that as precedent. So as of right now, that's what we're doing.
So basically, all the special session is just give you a little more flexibility to do something a little faster, maybe?
Yeah, so it gives you the flexibility of acting more quickly on legislation. Also, special session bills take effect 91 days after the 2 houses adjourn sine die the special session. So the 2 houses determine when they will adjourn a special session, and that will start that 91-day window ticking. So even like a majority vote bill would take effect 91 days. It doesn't have to wait till January of next year. And so it helps fast track.
It's basically a way kind of do an urgency bill without 2/3 vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's still not quite urgency, right. But 90 days instead of immediately, or instead of the next year.
Interesting. Okay. And so you just had Monday. You just had your swearing in. Kind of, what's the schedule for the rest of the year for you?
We're in organizational recess right now. Mm-hmm. So what that means is we did our swearing in, right. Organize the house, and now we're members can go back, you get staffed up. Get ready for session, but we kept the desk open in our house for 2 weeks to allow members to cross bills, and they've been crossing bills each day. So I think they have until Friday the 16th to cross bills. So even though we're not officially in session, having check-in sessions and floor sessions, members are introducing bills, get that 30-day window ticking, right. And then we come back in January, that Wednesday, the first Wednesday in January this year, and we'll hit the ground running. And of course, the beginning of a 2-year session, pretty tame in terms of volume. Usually the things we look for in early January, governor's budget being presented. Right. We'll have some floor ceremonies. But the bills, they still have to go through committees. They have their 30-day waiting period. And the Leg Council deadline to submit bill language is usually around the 3rd week of January. So a lot of bills aren't even eligible to be heard in committee until February or March, usually March.
And so kind of the desk is open, and I just saw Tina McKinnon tweet that she got AB1. Mm-hmm. How do you get AB1? And what is there a fight? Is there a fight for AB1? Is it literally just like staff sleep at the desk, get the bill across first? Like, there's got to be a scramble to get AB1.
You've just got to be first in line. So she was on her toes.
She was there before everyone else.
Yeah, and you'll have members that say, hey, I'm assembly member from District 62. I'd like AB 62, mm-hmm. or whatever the number is. Multiple times in the past, we've had members want to ban AB 666. That it was,
right,
the mark, the beast. Right. So Someone actually proposed a rule once in the 1990s to do away with that bill number. But bill numbers can be important for for members, and one is an important number.
Can be easy to remember. Yeah. So like if you wanted AB 62, can you request that, or you just have to time it?
You can request it, but you can't. It can't be reserved per se.
Right.
So it's all about timing and how many bills are coming into the desk each day. And back to the paperwork thing, it's still there's still some of that old school stamping bills but I think as members are tweeting out pictures of them putting their legislation across the desk, there's a certain feels better than emailing something, doesn't it? So you're actually physically doing something. This is a great idea.
Something moves across the desk when they say
Yeah, and so some of that tradition I think is important.
Yeah. So this year we kind of have something interesting. We have a couple elections that are still not decided. So as of Monday swearing in day, were members sworn in, or they're just holding the seats, just waiting, for these last couple elections to be decided? I think a couple of them are by 12 votes or
it's amazing. Right, I think Alex Vassar tweeted out that these two elections that are pending, one in the Senate, one in the Assembly, are the closest in California history. Mm-hmm. Talking about every few days it goes up 10 or 20 votes one way or the other. And the Constitution gives each house the authority to govern its internal affairs and to determine the qualifications of its members. So in a situation like this, 1980, we seated a member, Adrian Fonzie, and then a few weeks later, the election results flipped, and he was replaced by Patrick Johnson. Sometimes it's good to just wait that out and let something this close to wait it out, so you're not having this awkward thing where you swear in someone and then have to switch a few days later. Just let the results get certified and then use that to seat the member.
Nice. So desk is open till the 16th, and then kind of when do you guys start up again, getting ready for next year?
So January 4th.
You guys have your calendar ready?
The legislative calendar is out there. It's on the legislative website. So, we'll be in session at 1 p.m. on January 4th in the Assembly. Not sure what time the Senate's going in, but we will hit the ground running. The constitutional officers, I think, all get sworn in that week as well. Mm-hmm. Governor and everyone will be having, I'm sure, inaugural events and swearing-in ceremonies the first part of January, and those assembly floor sessions will also kick in.
Right. Awesome. Well, Brian, thanks so much for joining us and kind of give us a little sense and a little history. Very interesting stuff. Definitely learned a lot, and looking forward to seeing you next year. And may you have an interesting year and more interesting times coming ahead.
Thank you. I just try to keep people awake when I'm talking. So thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Thank you.